Hello, I am here for a Saturday edition of my Sunday sit-down chat because tomorrow I'm running the Stonemaier Games Design Day, which is kind of an unpub proto-spiel like convention. I don't know if you've heard of those. They're basically, Design Day is a time where people come and playtest their games, playtest games from other people, from other designers, and play published games and hopefully learn something from them. So it's a mix of all of that. We'll do it at Pieces Cafe here in St. Louis. And today, later this afternoon, I'm going to have a bunch of people over who are attending that convention who have come in from out of town and just want to play games. So they're coming over to my place in a few minutes or in a few hours. So I wanted to do my Sunday sit-down video today. And one topic that I've been thinking about a lot lately is teaching and learning and remembering games. So I thought I'd talk about games that make it easy to teach and learn and remember those games, and maybe some games that make it a little bit more difficult, or things that make it more difficult to do that. This topic came to mind. I was on the Ludology podcast the other day. I think the episode will air this Sunday, and we talked a little bit about that. I think Jeff asked me what I see as trends in gaming, and one thing I've noticed is that games are seem to be learning more and more. Tabletop games seem to be learning more and more from video games in terms of how they teach players how to play, and the importance of having a rule book, often maybe two rule books, like a quick reference guide and a rule book, or a teaching rule book and a main rule book, or an appendix and a rule book, things like that. And I just thought it's an interesting category of games. For me, it's something that I think about constantly when I'm designing games. And I didn't always do this. Really the game that made me start thinking about it, I have it over here. Let me see if I'll... Oh, yep, I disturbed Walter. There we go. Was Euphoria. Euphoria is not a complicated game, but it is rather difficult to teach because I put a lot of interconnected systems into the game. So if you want to understand one thing, to really understand it while you're teaching it or learning it, you need to also understand these two other things, and one or more of them may also have several other things that they're connected to. So in the end, I'm happy with how the design turned out because I think it's neat to have all these interconnected systems. But it makes it very difficult to teach Euphoria. I don't enjoy teaching Euphoria because of all those interconnected systems. So I think that's one thing that I try to watch out for now. And after I designed Euphoria, after it came out and after I realized how difficult it is to teach, I really started thinking about in games, how am I going to teach this game? As a designer, I'm probably going to end up teaching this game to a lot of people, whether it's during playtesting or publishing. How can I make that more enjoyable for myself? And if I know I'm making it more enjoyable for myself, I am probably also making it more enjoyable for other people in the future. Let me see if I can get Walter back over here. He was pretty happy for a minute there. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so I think a lot about this when I'm designing games now. How is this thing going to be easy to teach? Or how hard will it be to teach? And with Scythe, that was a big focus with Scythe. I knew Scythe was going to be a complex game, and so I wanted to try to make it as easy to teach and learn and remember as possible. And please note, I would say it's important that I keep mentioning remembering games. This is something I think about a lot too, because I want to give people a good reason to get our games back to the table. And I like when I learn a game. All right, there Walter goes. I won't try to bring him back. I like when I learn a game. And even if I don't play it for a few months, if I can come back to it and remember 95% of the game. Maybe there are a few things, maybe during setup, a few things that we need to look up and remember. But for the most part, it is very intuitive, and I can easily remember it. And I think there are a few things that help that remembering process. I'll come back to Scythe in a minute. This is a Sunday sit down. I'm going to ramble about various stuff. But one of the things that I think helps is having clear but not overbearing iconology. And by that I mean in iconology and heuristics. So basically the idea that everything you need to know about the game is in front of you. It isn't hidden in the rulebook. It isn't something that you need to remember. It isn't an exception to the rule. It's right there printed on your player mat, on the cards, on the board. On reference cards, whatever it is, that it's actually physically face up on the table. And face up, I think that's important too. There are too many cooperative games I play where there's information on both sides of a reference card. I want to see all of that. Just print a bigger card with all that information on one side so that it's always in front of me. This makes it really easy when you're like scanning a game board, when you're looking for, okay, how do I get points in this game? How do I do this? How do I get that? And you can scan all the information in front of you and see that information jump out and use that information to make your choices or to remember how to play. So I think clear icons and heuristics really help me remember games. Actually, yeah, those are the two main things. Those are the main things that help me remember a game after not playing it for a while. So back to Scythe. So Scythe has a quick start guide. This was something that so in addition to having those heuristics and those icons, everything you need to know in Scythe pretty much is on your player mat or is on one of the reference cards. And actually, I violate my own rule now that I'm saying about reference cards, because my reference cards for Scythe are double-sided. But I think on one side is information that you never really need, and on the other side there's information that you do need. But yes, I also on one of those cards is a quick start guide. That's how it works, because you have this quick start guide that kind of walks you through the first few turns. So if you're teaching Scythe, you can hand out these quick start guides and just say, okay, I'm going to explain a few core things, and you can then look at this card and follow the steps. And the card says, here are the most important things you need to know, and here's a recommendation of something to do on your first turn. Here's a recommendation for something to do on your second turn, and so on. And it isn't even all that limiting. Like you have some amount of choice in Scythe when you're deciding what to do. Anyway, I think that helps. I think that helps people teach and learn Scythe. And I like when games have those little quick start guides. I also like when games have great tutorials. This is something that I worked really hard on for Charterstone. I think to some success, but not as perfect as I wish it had been. With Charterstone, there's a very slim rule book, and it has a few core concepts. You can read it with your friend. Like, we recommend that someone reads the rule book before you start playing. But you can just sit down with your friends and read through this very, very thin rule book. Most of it's empty because you're adding rules to Charterstone as you play. And so the first time you open Charterstone and start playing, you draw a specific card, and that card says, hey, do this thing. And then that card might be a rule sticker that you then put in the rule book. So you're adding a rule permanently to the rule book, or adding a story element to the rule book. So I wanted this to work. I don't think it was completely successful for Charterstone, because the risk in doing that is if you have a rule that players miss during that process, it might be really hard for them to find it, because and they might miss it completely unless they look at the FAQ and realize that they missed that rule. So I think that's kind of the catch when it comes to unraveling tutorials like what I did with Charterstone. I think a better way to do it is let's see if I can pull it out. Actually, I have a couple good examples. I'll start with mechs versus minions. I don't have the tutorial in front of me. It was somewhere in the bottom of this giant box. I just have the box lid. Mechs versus minions has a fantastic tutorial. I'm guessing that they pulled from their video game experience in making this tutorial, because when I played mechs versus minions, we sat down with the tutorial and we just started playing. The tutorial walked us through it step by step. It kept us engaged. This was a really big thing. We were doing things throughout the whole tutorial process. So it would explain a concept, and then it would have us do that concept. And then it would move on to the next concept, and we would do it. So we were learning the game actively with the tutorial guiding us throughout the process. If you can find it online, it's a superb tutorial to learn from. And it works really, really well. The other one that came to mind was Fog of Love. Fog of Love has a really, really fantastic tutorial. And I think Fog of Love in particular does what I wish Charterstone had done, in that Fog of Love has a rulebook that you can refer to whenever you want. But you don't have to look at the rulebook at all. You can just open the box and draw a card, and that card will tell you what to do next. And it'll continue for a while like that. Like, you'll draw a card, and then it'll tell you to do something. And similar to Mechs versus Minions, you're actually actively doing something. You'll make a choice in the game, and then the tutorial will say, okay, when you get to this point in the game, read this next card. And the decks are actually stacked so that the next card will come up So if you've just read card 15, you've done a few things, card 15 will have you drawing from a specific deck of cards that is used in a normal way in the game. It's not not necessarily a completely preset deck. And then at a certain point, you'll lift up a card, and there'll be a card that looks out of place there. It'll be card 16, and you'll read that and follow the rules on that. But Fog of Love, because it pairs that tutorial with an actual pre-printed rulebook, during that tutorial process, if you have a question, you can't find it on this jumble of 30 cards that you've just unlocked, you can just look at the rulebook and find that rule. They're separate, and as you're doing that, I learned spatially. When I learned rule books, I remember the place in the rule book where I saw this rule, and so Fog of Love creates that sense of space and place by letting you refer to the rule book whenever you want, while also having this really wonderful tutorial. The other one that came to mind was Root. Root, a fairly recent game where I played the tutorial. I think a tutorial is necessary in Root because otherwise, you're essentially learning 4 different games if you're playing a 4-player game of Root. And so the tutorial instead walks each player through their turn. It says, okay, do this, and then do that. It gives you a little bit of choice. There might be a little bit of randomness, but for the most part, you're doing exactly what the tutorial does for 2 turns. So it walks you through 2 turns of the game, and at that point, it's explained all the concepts for the game. And it just works really, really well. I think it's a double-sided tutorial, and you just pass it around the table. So I will take my turn, following what the tutorial says. Someone else takes their turn, and so on around the table. Root also does something really cool where it gives each player reference cards for the other player's factions, and these cards tell you what those factions are all about in a very concise way. So I don't need to understand all the things that the Marquis de Fox is doing. I just need to understand what that little card tells me. It says, okay, Marquis de Fox, they'll start out on the board, and they're good at this, and they're good at this, and if you want to prevent them from being too powerful, do this. Really, really cleverly done in an asymmetric game. I really like how that game helps me learn how to play Root. Let's see, I have a bunch of notes on my screen here about different things I wanted to talk about. Okay, one little note. I think that rewarding games are easier to teach than punishing games. So a rewarding game, in my opinion, is a game that rewards you for doing stuff. If you do things, it gives you a benefit for it. Opposed to a punishing game where either by doing or not doing things, you are punished for it. You lose points for it. You lose an advantage by doing that, or by not doing it. And I think rewarding games are much, much easier to teach because you can just start playing them knowing that the choices that you make, that you and other players might make in the first few rounds, they might not be the right choices, but at least you haven't been punished for them. At least you don't have a huge setback because of those choices. One of my games that I think does this really well is Viticulture. Viticulture is a very rewarding game. You're constantly getting bonuses and perks and free stuff. And so even if you play a year of the game, a round of the game, and you don't really understand it, you're kind of learning as you go. You're doing some stuff. You're doing some good choices. You're making some bad choices. At the end of that year, you are still competing like everyone else for the game. Even a more experienced player, you will still be in competition for that game. So a bad first round or first year in Viticulture doesn't make you want to restart the game. You feel like you've already made progress. You've already gotten some good stuff. The other thing, actually, that I think Viticulture does well, completely unintentionally, this is before I really knew what I was doing, Viticulture breaks the game down into smaller segments by season. So when I'm teaching Viticulture, I'll set up the board and I'll say, okay, the point of the game, the objective is to get 20 points or more. Here's what the point icon looks like. You can look for this point icon in different places on the board, and especially on these wine order cards. And now we're going to start to play. And maybe I'll explain a little bit about worker placement, but I can actually wait to do that until the summer season. Because in Viticulture, the thing that I do is I say, okay, we're just going to start to play. Here's how spring works. Do the thing in spring. This is in spring. You wake up, you get some bonuses, you determine how your workers, the order of your workers, what it's going to be this year, and I have players make their choices in the spring. And because Viticulture is a rewarding game, because these are perks, these are bonuses that you're getting, there is no bad choice to make. You feel like you've gotten something good. So I think those two things, rewarding elements and sometimes having games that are broken down into different steps, can really help with the learning process. One thing that I think can hurt the learning process a little bit is if you give players, before you even start the game, if you give players a choice during setup, like a choice between two abilities. I think there are ways around this, but I generally avoid this in games because if you're teaching a game or if you're returning to a game after not having played it for a long time, but especially if you're teaching a game, I I don't know, like I feel a little helpless when the game gives me a choice when I don't understand it yet. So it creates a situation where I either require someone to explain more to me before I make that choice, or I make a blind choice. Uh, so I generally avoid that, but I think games can get around it by if all those choices are good choices, that can work, and ideally that is the case when you're choosing like asymmetric abilities at the beginning of the game. The other thing I think that can do is if you give players other ways to make that choice. So, like based on a character. So even if I have no idea what the ability does, how this works with the game, if I think the character looks cool, if the art for the character looks cool, that gives me some reason to choose that character over the other character. So I think that can help, but I generally avoid giving players choices in games before the setup process even begins or during the setup process. Uh, Lords of Waterdeep, I think, is a game that is very easy to teach and learn because you start off with very, very few actions in the game. I'm sorry I don't have this game to hold up in front of you, but with Waterdeep there are only a few actions on the board, and the heuristics of it are really, really easy. You can see the economy of the game by looking at the board. You can see that if I put a worker here, I get 2 orange workers, but if I put a worker here, I only get 1 purple worker. So that says to me that orange workers are easier to get and less valuable than the purple workers at a 2-to-1 ratio. With Lords of Waterdeep, you don't have a lot of workers to start out with. I think it's just 2. It might depend on the player count. And you only have a few actions to choose from. The game expands as you play. So this is a really, really great technique, I think, in games where as you play each game of Waterdeep, you're adding more buildings to the board, so you're adding more options. But Waterdeep doesn't start off with all those things built. That would be overwhelming. Instead, it starts out with a few core actions, and it gives that sense of building, and it eases players into the game a lot easier because there are fewer actions to choose from. I think cooperative games are often much easier to teach than competitive games because it's easier for one player to just guide players for a few turns. In competitive games, that's actually how I teach Scythe. Scythe is competitive, and I will guide players through their first few turns. But that can often feel weird to people that in the competitive game I'm telling you what to do. In a cooperative game, that's much easier to do. We're all on the same page. We're all working together, so it makes sense that I might guide you a little bit more than I would in the competitive game. One nice thing I found about the modern age of teaching and learning games is that there are a lot of resources, and you can use all of them as a designer, as a publisher. So there are YouTube channels like Watch It Played that will let you create a video, let you pay Rodney to create a video to show people how to play the game in video form. We have the rule books, we have quick reference guides, we have quick start guides, we have tutorials, and I like that you can choose from multiple tools to put them in your game. I often do that with my games. I often have a watch and play video. Obviously, I have a rule book. I often have a quick reference guide, and sometimes I have a tutorial. So I like giving players that option to choose which learning method and teaching method is the best for them. And this actually came up in a game that we're developing right now from another designer. I'm the developer on it, where it's a game that we really need to focus on finding a good way to teach it. And we have been thinking a lot about how to teach this game. And something we realized in the latest wave of blind playtesting is that people learn in different ways, and different types of gamers, different levels of experience of gamers learn in different ways too. So a tutorial that tells you exactly what to do on your turn for a few turns might end up being pretty frustrating for an experienced player who just really does want to take turns and experiment and try different things. Whereas it's great for a beginning player. So in this way, I think it's good. And what we're going to do in this game is we're probably going to include a tutorial that you can use for people who aren't as comfortable with games. But for experienced gamers, we're going to have an option for them as well. And you might be able to mix and match them. So in a group where you have a more experienced gamer and someone who's less comfortable, they might learn the game in different ways simultaneously. So that was important for me to remember and learn from this, that people learn in different ways. And as a publisher, I have the ability to include different ways to learn the game in the game itself. Let's see if I think I've covered all my topics. Oh, rulebook length. Yeah, this is one last thing I wanted to bring up. I've been thinking about rulebook length a lot lately because, like the other day, I wanted to learn a game for game night to teach my friends, and I had a few different options to learn from. And basically, I chose the shortest rulebook, which may have not been the best way to do it, but I got lucky. I chose a short rulebook that was actually very good. And it just made me remember that at any given time, people have a wealth of choices of games that they can choose off their shelf, choose to learn. And if they can choose the rulebook, the 4-page rulebook versus the 32-page rulebook, they're probably going to choose, at certain times, they're going to choose that 4-page rulebook. Not every time. I know some people really like digging through long rulebooks, and there have been times where I have really enjoyed that. But I think it's really important for me to keep that in mind as a designer, that the rulebook length does have an impact on whether or not someone is willing to even open that rulebook and see what's in it and see how good it is. So that was a learning point for me, a realization the other day when I did that. So I'm trying to keep that in mind for my games. At the same time, I don't want to sacrifice rulebook quality by making a shorter rulebook with like fewer examples, fewer visuals, but it does make me more inclined to maybe have a teaching rulebook in the game, like a rulebook or a learning rulebook that's maybe very concise and very, very short, that someone could just pick up and learn the game from that very concise rulebook, and then know that they have a much more robust reference when they need it. I think there are dangers with this too, because sometimes, like if you're learning from the simple rulebook, when you're ready to look up a question, you need to have a point of reference, an easy way to find it in the longer rulebook, and not all rulebooks do that well. But I want to give people a very low barrier to entry to get my games to the table, whether it's for the first time or whether it's for the second time, but with people who don't know how to play it. So if you know how to play it, but your friends don't know how to play it, I want you to feel good about teaching it to them, and I want them to feel comfortable learning the game in an easy way. And I want to create games that are easy to remember how to play. So if you do come back to it after 6 months or a year, that you don't have to completely relearn it. Those are all things that I think about when I design games, and often when I play games as well. Like, I think about that constantly with games. In fact, I was thinking about it the other day with Between Two Castles, which I think is very, very easy to teach because it has a single reference card that basically explains everything in the game, and it's easy to go through this reference card and say, okay, this is a core concept, this is what it looks like on this card. You don't even have to explain it tile by tile. You can just say, this is what this icon means. Now you know how all these tiles work since you know what that icon means. So yeah, this is my Saturday sit-down video. I know it's a bit of a rambling chat about teaching and learning and remembering games, but hopefully it's given you some thoughts. And I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments about games that you find are easy to learn, easy to teach, and maybe some games that are rather hard to learn or teach or remember after not playing them for a long time. I'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, take care. Have a great weekend. Bye.